Hi, I'm Charles Fournier, and I'll be talking about Hemingway and masculinity. So this focus on masculinity starts, again, from a very young age for Hemingway. Being a part of the rhetoric of living a strenuous life, of being a strong man, is something that kind of carries throughout his whole life. Now, this is in contrast to a little bit of how he was treated as a child. Hemingway is known to very, very much dislike his mother. I can't remember the other writer, but another writer had mentioned that he had never met anyone that had hated their mother as much as Hemingway did. And part of this is maybe tied to how he was treated, but he was also dressed in girls' dresses up until about the age of 6. He had a long haircut for a good portion of his young life. And so all of this kind of developed an animosity towards the feminine, towards his mother, and maybe towards women as a whole. He did have 4 wives. He had a hard time with relationships with women. And so a lot of this could be seen as maybe his overcompensation to be hyper-masculine. So throughout Hemingway's life, he was extraordinarily competitive with anybody that could be his equal. So other writers, even women that maybe were outspoken. So when he was in Paris in the 1920s and friends with F. Scott Fitzgerald, at one point F. Scott Fitzgerald approached him, and this was after being criticized by his wife Zelda. F. Scott tells Hemingway, and he says, Zelda says that my penis is not the right size, and he was concerned about this, and so he asked Hemingway, would you look? So Hemingway did. He took a look, and he then took F. Scott to the Louvre, and they went and looked at statues, and Hemingway pointed out and said, you know, it's about perspective. And so what we see is that right there, it seems like Hemingway is being a good friend, but immediately after this, Hemingway writes letters, or a letter out, and he makes fun of F. Scott Fitzgerald for this self-consciousness and for how Zelda treats him. And so Hemingway is consistently throughout his life emasculating the friends around him. He's cutting them down, and he's doing it in a way that is maybe making him higher up as far as being more masculine than the others. And we see that this works for him. By the 1950s, he is the poster child for masculinity. He's on the cover of many men's magazines. He is interviewed for men's magazines about hunting and fishing and women and drinking. And we have all of these qualities that are very much tied to masculinity that Hemingway embodied. He boxed, he fought, he drank, he said what he wanted, he traveled the world, he did all of these things that at the time was seen as the ideal of American masculinity. And it could be this thing where he informed masculinity for America, or he was informed by masculinity for America. Either way, it's this relationship that helped build some of his fame, because he was the man's man. On the top of one of the men's magazines, it said, Hemingway, America's #1 He-Man, which, I mean, that says it all. He is the He-Man of America at that time. And so when we're thinking about masculinity, he writes this hypermasculinity into his characters. He writes this exceptionalism, or this American exceptionalism, into his characters that's very much tied to masculinity. In several of his short stories, the main character is more masculine than others. They stand up and they fight, or they don't cry when they're injured, or they're able to struggle through the pain, whereas other men, especially if they're not white or if they're not American, will struggle with the pain. And this happens again and again through many of his stories and many of his books. And so Hemingway is consistently trying to put himself or his characters above others. And so we see this in books where characters are traveling because they speak fluent, whatever the language is, whether it be Spanish or French, and they're seen as essentially natives, or they're better at passing for native than any of the other men that maybe are within the main character's party. And so we see that there's this ideal of being so masculine, or being so good at maybe moving about, or having these abilities to gain language, or this idea of masculinity, that he can pass, or these main characters can pass wherever they go. They can pass as a local. And so part of this masculinity is very much maybe tied to wanting to be included, or wanting to be the best. Very much growing up with competitiveness is that goal, to be the best. And we see that with his relationships with other writers, with even women within his life, that he has to be better than them. That could arguably be part of the reason that His relationship with Martha Gellhorn did not work out because she was a successful writer, and that level, that match could not work for Hemingway. And so, thinking about masculinity, it's important to note that whether he says it or not, that is very much a priority in how he behaves and how he writes. He does not want to be seen as feminine, especially in a public space. Now, with that said, it's worth looking at maybe some of his books that were published posthumously, like Garden of Eden, where we have the masculine lines kind of bend and shift a little bit. And so maybe there was another element of Hemingway where that hypermasculinity, there was room for maybe not being that character, especially when he was outside of America.